Today, I put Arthur Morgan and John Marston to the test using 9 different categories to once and for all prove who the better character is. 95% of my viewers are unsubscribed, so if you like content like this, please subscribe. We're going to start off with their backstories, and Arthur honestly doesn't really have that much of a backstory in Red Dead Redemption 2, while there is a little bit where he talks about his unborn child in the optional mission with Rains Falls. And they also talk about his former wife who was also killed with the child at the same time. You kind of have to scour for that information. Like, even going into the mission, which is like optional in its own right, you have to pick the specific dialogue choice to get it. And I feel like clearly Rockstar didn't think it was that important to like add in Arthur's backstory. Like, if you want to scour for it, you can find it. But I feel like you don't really get that much about it. And like, even stuff inside the gang, like Arthur's former bank robberies, I feel like you don't really get to hear like talked about that much. It's just kind of like on the surface there, and while it does like drive the story in its own way with like Mary Linton, like that part is also in there, and there's like a little bit of backstory with that. There's not really that much that you actually have to see as the backstory. The Rains Fall stuff is optional, the Mary Linton stuff is optional, and most of the other information besides like the casual conversations with Hosea or Dutch talking about old times isn't really included in the actual game, like, or in the parts where you actually have to play through. So I feel like Rockstar didn't really see Arthur's backstory as that essential to the game, and I feel like they just wanted him to be this guy, like this big bad guy, and turn him into the good guy by the end of the game. And that makes sense, but I feel like it really weakens his backstory as a whole throughout the game. John's backstory in Red Dead Redemption 1 is far and away better than Arthur's because it actually drives the story. The whole point of John's like story in Red Dead Redemption 1 is that he has to go and find and kill Bill and Javier, who are 2 members of his former gang, and he has to do that because, you know, the Pinkertons have captured his wife and kid. So it's like you clearly learn about his outlaw lifestyle and his wife and kids kind of throughout the entire story, and the backstory is the whole point of the entire game. So it's like you kind of see how these conversations with Bill, Javier, and Dutch flesh out John's character before the game and flesh out just kind of how he is as a person. And you also see the true extent of like John's crimes when Fordham and Ross read them, where it's like 100 murders, a ton of bank robberies, and etc. And you realize that John really isn't a good person. He's killed hundreds of people, and while he might be a better person now, he should still like serve for his crimes in some way. I mean, maybe you can just say like he has served for his crimes in a way because, you know, he had to do these things to fight Javier and Bill. But I just think it's really interesting because the backstory is the whole important part of Red Dead Redemption 1. So I think the backstory category easily should go to John Marston just because it drives the entire story of Red Dead Redemption 1. The second category I chose was personality, and Arthur clearly is the much more personable character than John, and I feel like John necessarily isn't a really fun person to play as in Red Dead Redemption 1. Of course, he kind of deserves to be pretty ticked off because his family literally got taken away from him, and he's doing this all, and he doesn't have basically anyone to rely on. It's only himself. He does play this like stereotypical Western character where it's like you're the only one that you can count on, and you're gonna have to do this all on alone for a specific reason. But I think both Arthur and John do have like some solid comebacks. Like, John can be fun at certain times, but it's like he's on a goal. He's like Liam Neeson in Taken. He just has one thing to do, and he's gonna do it no matter what. Arthur is like a much more friendly guy, and there's just not as high of stakes during Red Dead Redemption 2. So you can really see like Arthur's nice personality come out. He's just like a much more friendly guy, and John is this guy who's like angry at the world, and like he has to do something. Like, he has to find his wife and kids and find a way to get back to them. So John doesn't even really seem to like his family either, which is like a whole weird thing in that, where, you know, especially with Jack and Uncle, who like technically are his family members in a way, or like Uncle at least technically his family member, but like he doesn't really seem to like Jack that much, even though he is his kid. I know they had to do that because, you know, you had to show that John's not the greatest guy, but he really only seems to like Abigail. And while he does clearly love Jack in a way, he loves him more as an extension of Abigail than he actually does love Jack himself. Either way, though, John is just not a fun character to play as. You see this guy, he's just angry at the world, and you just kind of want him to be nicer to certain people in the game, like especially when he's just antagonizing Uncle constantly. I mean, they clearly do it to each other, and they clearly do have like a love for each other, especially when you see Uncle's death. But it's just so interesting to see just John being an asshole to like most characters in the entire game, and Arthur's just clearly this much more fun-loving guy. You can just like hang out with him. He's just the guy to have a beer with. And clearly you see with like Lenny and Sean Maguire and all these characters that are kind of like these weird guys in their own right, they kind of really just mesh with Arthur. Like Arthur meshes with so many different characters, and you can see that in a lot of these stranger missions where there are all these eccentric personalities, and Arthur just perfectly fits fine into them. And John is this guy who just hates civilization. He just wants to be on his own. He's just this perfect like Western character. And John's just like honestly not a fun, like he's a fun character to play as, but like you get into these cutscenes and it's just like, oh, I need to do this. Like I'm on a mission. Like I understand it, but Arthur clearly has the better personality. So I'm going to give this round to Arthur. The next category I chose was intelligence, and Arthur simply, to me, doesn't have that much outside intelligence. While he is a very smart character in certain ways, I feel like you very much learn along with Arthur throughout the entire game. Like, you learn what racism is. Arthur doesn't really understand things like racism. He just doesn't seem to understand the real world because he's been in this cult his entire life. He's been in the cult of Dutch, and I guess Hosea in his own right is like part of this cult as well. So it's just really interesting to see that this guy, Arthur, doesn't have his own worldview until the story actually starts. And if you only play Red Dead Redemption 2, you kind of get to see this worldview through Arthur, and you kind of, begin to relate with him because you're seeing the world being built as Arthur is seeing the world being built. John in Red Dead Redemption 1 has kind of learned from Arthur's worldview in the prequel and added some of his own life experiences to become an even smarter man. While he does fall for some like traps between certain people like Irish, and a lot of the stupider people in Red Dead Redemption 1 actually take advantage of John in some way, you can clearly tell it's because John is like really short-sighted. He kind of understands a lot more about the world than someone like Arthur does, just because he is a little bit like wiser in his years, because Arthur never really got out of his little bubble, and John like has lived that life. He already stopped living the life with the outlaws, and he's been traveling around with Abigail and Jack. I mean, even though that's probably not taken into account in Red Dead Redemption 1, but it still makes sense. And you can tell in like John's coy personality, he kind of thinks about every word he says. He doesn't want to give up too much of his like actual life before, meeting all these people, because he just wants to be this guy like on a specific mission. He doesn't want to tell people about his backstory because they could use that against him. And even though he did fall into these traps, especially in Mexico, where it's just like he kind of has these horse blinders on and he's only looking forward to his goal. He's short-sighted. He sees his goal is almost in reach, potentially in reach. He can get Bill, but then he misses out on some other details, which again, there might not be that much intelligence in that, but he kind of does know how to play people off of each other, like in Mexico, where he plays off the two sides of the war between the rebels and the government. And of course, the government eventually does betray him. And yeah, again, John's like ability to see things is kind of hard. Like he clearly is an intelligent man, but he just doesn't see things in the future. Like he's not able to, think things out in that way. But I think Arthur clearly in the same way is a smarter man than he looks, but in the same way, he can't really think on his own. He always thinks in Dutch's and Hosea's worldview instead of his own. And John is a lot more of a very smart man, but he kind of overlooks some very simple things. And I think that's why John, to me, is the smarter person. He kind of understands how the world turns and knows a lot more things than I think Arthur does in Red Dead Redemption 2. So that's why I think John has to take this category in intelligence, even though to me it is a pretty slim difference between the two of them, because they just understand things on different levels. Arthur is a lot more like practical, while John is a lot more like theoretical intelligence. The next category I chose was humor, and I actually think that both Arthur and John are extremely funny in both Red Dead Redemption 2 and Red Dead Redemption 1, but John's humor is a lot more like this dry humor, where it's like kind of making fun of people and making like it's more funny to the actual person playing the game than the actual characters in game, versus like Arthur's all these like comebacks that seem a lot funnier in the game than they actually are in real life, because it's like more of banter and it's more about his personality interacting with some of the other people. And I still think he's a really funny guy even with that. Like Arthur, just this insanely charismatic guy that people want to be around, and even when he makes fun of them, it's always like, you know, a funny joke, and it's always, you know, kind of like fun. Like Arthur's this nice guy that also makes these like pretty witty remarks. And again, John kind of does the same thing, but John is playing like this hard-nosed guy that can't have fun. And when he does make like a witty remark, it's more of this comeback to someone else making fun of him in his own right, which like doesn't really happen with Arthur. Arthur's kind of the one starting the riffs. And I don't know, I feel like Arthur's just a lot more of a funny character to be around. And that's probably due to the tone of the two games, where one is more set as a Western versus one is more an action adventure game with like comedic elements. So I think Arthur clearly is the more humorous character. There's some great missions where I think it's really funny to play as Arthur, like the one with Lenny where they drink, and like the one with Hosea where they also drink, and just any time when Arthur's with Sean Maguire, because Sean Maguire is one of the funniest characters in Red Dead Redemption 2, and I just think in general, anytime they're together, it's just a great time. So Arthur clearly has to take the humor round, evening it up at 2-2. The next category I have is relatability, and I think both John and Arthur are very, very relatable characters. I think it really just depends on who you are as a person, who you will relate to most. But to me, I feel like John feels like a much more real life person, while Arthur, at least on High Honor, feels more like a saint doing all these amazing things to help people out of the kindness of his heart. Maybe this is a controversial opinion, but I just think John, to me, relates a lot better because I think he's just a more pragmatic person. He does things that are realistic versus Arthur does a lot more like idealistic things. And a good stranger mission that makes a lot of sense in terms of their relatability is Idealism and Pragmatism for Beginners, the one where you get to, you know, meet Saint Denis' mayor and you get to either spare or kill John Mark, and you get to see like who the mayor of the town's going to be for Saint Denis. And Jean Marc is this guy who always wants to do things the right way, the ideal way, the way that, you know, Arthur kind of sees things in life. He sees things in the long-term way, where he always wants things to be done the right way, and kind of in that sense, versus John thinks about things in the more practical way. And I think while you're playing the video game, you might be like, oh, I want to do things in the ideal way, the High Honor way, the way they want you to play the game. But I just think if you're a real life person, you're not going to be doing things in this idealistic sense. You're going to be doing things in the practical way to do things. And, you know, you might be helping out these widows that, you know, need help, and you're going to teach them how to shoot and live on their own. But I think Arthur, as a real character, isn't going to be doing that. He has more important goals to focus on. And while he might be this more honorable guy in the actual canon, I just don't think he's that honorable. Like, he definitely has some honorable streaks, and he is getting redeemed over the course of the story. But I just don't think in real life he's that guy. I think John, honestly, just to me, relates to me like a real person. He's got a goal to do. He's got to save his wife and his kids from the government, who's literally blackmailing him and doing these things. And he's willing to take big risks and kill people and do all these horrible, horrendous things just to get his wife and kids back. And I just think that's what a real person would do in that situation. And while you're playing the video game, you might think that like Arthur's is a more complex character and a more relatable character because it's all about the thoughts of that game. But I think in Red Dead Redemption 1, if I was put in that situation, if I was put in both situations, I think John would be the character that would more likely relate to and like play like in that situation. So I think John, to me, is the more relatable character just because I'm more of a pragmatic individual versus an ideal individual. And I think that could go either way, just depending on how you see things in life. But I think just most people would be more like a pragmatic person because you're not always going to be thinking about the long term. You're more going to be thinking about the short term and how things can affect you there versus the long term and how things will affect you then, because you don't know what's going to happen in the long term. So in my opinion, John is the more relatable character, and that puts him up 3-2 in this section. The next category I ranked the two of them on was death, and I think John's death completely catches you off guard because there's this tonal shift into this more happy life that John's living. He's connecting with his son, you know, he's having some fun time with Abigail and kind of connecting with her again in her own way, and being with Uncle and trying to get his life back on track after hunting down his former members of his gang. And you see this complete tonal shift going from that to immediately being hunted by the person that he was hunting people for. And I think that, to me, is what makes John Marston's death in Red Dead Redemption 1 not a complete shock, because you can kind of piece it together if you really think about it. But it's this tonal shift from something that seems extremely happy to something where it's sacrifices must be made, and John is the best sacrifice in that situation. So John, does all these things for his family, and this is his final gift to them, where he's saving them, he's sacrificing his own life so that they can live on. I just think that's beautiful in its own way. And Arthur's death is also beautiful as well, because you have this guy that understands his death. His death is hanging over him, and he wants to do all these things before his death. But I feel like that makes his death even less climactic in its own way. Of course you do get a nice fight with Micah, and his death kind of gets sped up a lot because he does have this fight with Micah and he has all this stress, and he never really gets out into an area where something will help his tuberculosis. But Arthur's death is clearly less climatic, just because you do have something where this character kind of got to say his goodbyes to people and got to do all these things, and John just gets to say goodbye, family, honey, I'm gonna see you later, I'm gonna see you soon. And he does get to say his goodbyes, but he never really gets to make peace with those people like the way Arthur does. Arthur gets to send John off, he gets the little hat passing, and of course Arthur's gonna die eventually, versus John, you don't really see it coming. So I think Arthur's death clearly is important as well to the story, but I feel like the things that lead up to Arthur's death is more important and overshadows the actual death to me. And I think Arthur's death is very emotional because you get invested in the character. Same thing with John, but John's death is just such a crazy tonal shift that I feel like his death in general is just so much better than Arthur's, because you can kind of see Arthur's coming from a mile away, versus John's, it has this happy and fun loving thing, and you immediately switch into something that's dark and depressing, and he makes a sacrifice for everyone. So in my opinion, John Marston's death in Red Dead Redemption 1 is better than Arthur Morgan's death in Red Dead Redemption 2. So John goes up 4-2. The next category I'm ranking them on is the redemption of the story. Of course, being called Red Dead Redemption, you need to rank them based off of their redemption. And while I believe that John has a solid kind of redemption arc, kind of unraveling his whole outlaw lifestyle throughout the game, just becoming a more interesting character as the game goes on, he's kind of a similar character in the beginning of the game to the end of the game. He's kind of this hotshot guy who, kind of thinks more of himself than he actually is. And he does begin to love his family more and cherish them more in that way. He doesn't really get to redeem himself. He kind of does in a way where it's he really lets his family be able to do whatever they want. They don't have to be burdened by his lifestyle and his old outlaw life. But there's not really the same redemption as someone like Arthur is, because John does get some changes where he gets to see a lot of the people that he became friends with throughout the game, murdered right in front of him. But you don't see him turn into this much more sympathetic character like you do with Arthur, where Arthur goes from this hardened gunslinger who's really brainwashed by Dutch and Hosea, and become an actual nice person who wants to change the world and stop this kind of whole outlaw thing and just help the people that he sees instead of hurting them, which he's been doing for his entire life. And you see him kind of taking that hard outside shell and kind of it melting all down throughout the game, where he becomes this sympathetic character. And eventually you see that culminate in the end, where he helps John, I guess in a way, not live the same lifestyle, even though John does live the same lifestyle. But you help him get away from the outlaw lifestyle for, I think, 12 years. So, John got to live 12 more years than Arthur. So I think that really works in tandem with both games. And I just think that is what makes Arthur's redemption so much better. Because you see him turn from this guy who's done a lot of bad things to be wow, Arthur's really changed going throughout the entire story. And he's really redeemed himself in a way, even though you can't redeem murdering 100 people. So the redemption 100,000,000% has to go to Arthur, because I just don't really see John having a real redemption arc. The last thing I'm going to be ranking them in is the story arc, and John has a solid story arc with, being an outlaw gunslinger, and you get to learn about John throughout the game and, kind of unravel his whole backstory, unravel what he's all about, and kind of understand like his reasons for doing certain things. You don't really get to see him again, like change. Like he doesn't redeem himself. He does some things where it's like the redemption clearly in both games, like they never fully redeem themselves. You can't really redeem yourself for doing 100 murders, but John, again, just, kind of becomes nicer to his family, kind of understands and respects them more and begins to cherish them more. But there's not really that much of a story arc. You kind of get this like very, very Western feeling from Red Dead Redemption 1. The great thing about Red Dead Redemption 1 is the tone. You don't get to see the same tone in Red Dead Redemption 2 because they shifted away from the whole Western like story and feel and went into a more action adventure game. And I just think the atmosphere and the tone in that is this guy who's like on his own solo doing things and kind of is just like a gruff guy, which John perfectly embodies, but you don't really get to see him change over the entire story. He kind of plays the Western character to a perfect T, and then you get to see it change a little bit as he actually gets his family back. But it kind of seems like he's the same guy from the beginning of the game to the end. And I just think they didn't do the game as much justice with like playing with John's character and trying to change him a little bit, especially when he went back to Dutch and Javier and Bill. And it seemed like he already made up his mind on those characters. And I think, especially when you see Abigail and she's like, you didn't go back to Bill or John, you didn't go back to Bill or Dutch. And it's like, yeah, he didn't go back to them. And I think if there was a little bit more like pulling in that direction, especially with Dutch because he was the leader of the gang, and like John clearly had his mind set up from the beginning, they wanted his family back, and there's not that much story arc going on there. Like he kind of is the same guy from the beginning to the end, and you see how he changes his environment, not how his environment changes him. And it's basically the opposite with Arthur, because you see how his environment of Dutch and Hosea really sheltered him from the real world. And you see how all these other people come and change Arthur's life and make him this more sympathetic person. You see how people like Strauss, show him that maybe it's not a good idea to be loaning money to poor people because they probably have more important things to spend their money on instead of paying back interest to a gang who, definitely needs the money in their own right, but like don't really need the money as much as these poor people do. And like when it clearly gets him into trouble with Thomas Downs, Arthur just changes his perspective on life because he only has a certain amount of time left and he needs to, make good with his sins and what he's done in his life. And he kind of wanted to change into a better person and start doing better for the world while he had time left. So you really get to see him change from, this hardened gunslinger to this really soft character. And again, while he isn't redeeming himself, he also gets to see, like, he gets to take away the mirror on Dutch and like show him, Dutch, this is the guy you are. You're running a cult. You are getting betrayed by this guy, Micah, who's been riding you guys out to the Pinkertons. And it's just this great story arc, which I feel like is not the same in Red Dead Redemption 1, where they're going for a lot more of a genre game versus once they got that budget for Red Dead Redemption 2, they kind of turned the story into like a much bigger thing, which again takes away some of the themes of the game where it's like the Western theme. It's more of like, again, an action adventure game than like a straight Western action adventure game. But I still think Red Dead Redemption 2 just has one of the greatest story arcs in all time, just having Arthur, turn into this guy that you can relate with. And you see him seeing like the rest of his time and being like, wow, I need to do things to change things. And it's like you see the person that he's looked up to his entire life, Dutch, turn to the person he must hate because Dutch is doing things to ruin the gang and ruin Arthur's entire livelihood and basically killing like a lot of the people that he's loved his entire life, especially like with Hosea. So you see like a man that has been brainwashed by this one person and see that twist against him. So I think it's just amazing. And Arthur's story arc is probably one of the best in all of gaming and probably one of the best in all of just fiction in general, because you get to see it play out over 60 hours, and just you see him change into this amazing person by the end of the game, because he sees that he doesn't have time left, so he can't be doing these bad things, because he needs to focus on the things that actually matter, like getting John and his family to safety and getting his loved ones into a better spot than they were before they were with him. So I think that's why Arthur clearly takes the story arc part of the game, and this is going to tie it up all at 4-4. So we're going to have one last section for the tiebreaker. In personal opinion, I think Arthur does get the slight nudge here, just because I feel like the categories he did win in with like story arc, redemption, are a little bit more impactful than the ones that John won in. And I also think that Rockstar didn't have the resources. Like, it was made by one studio, Rockstar San Diego, made Red Dead Redemption 1, and Rockstar, the whole studio, made Red Dead Redemption 2. So there's not enough time to like develop John's character in Red Dead Redemption 1. You don't get to spend the time with him that you do in Red Dead Redemption 2. Like, even Red Dead Redemption 2 probably has as much John screen time as Red Dead Redemption 1 does. So I think really Arthur's story is played out in a much better way, and he just becomes a better character because you get to spend a lot more time with him than you do in Red Dead Redemption 1 with John. So I think just the fact that they had more resources and they had this way to develop Arthur, and they had all this time, like, you get to spend 50 hours with Arthur, so there's a lot more time to develop your connection to Arthur. So to me, it's pretty clear that Arthur is a little bit better of a character than John, but I think John is basically the best character Rockstar San Diego could have made with the resources they had and with the budget they had. So I think both these characters are amazing, but in my personal opinion, Arthur Morgan gets the slight nudge over John Marston. If you guys did make it this far, thank you for watching this whole video, and let me know what you guys do think. Do you have Arthur over John? Do you have John over Arthur? Either way, let me know in the comments down below, and there should be some videos popping up now, so definitely click on those.